Hello, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Today's presentation is Flattening the Other Curve, Dealing with the Looming Mental Health Crisis. I'm Jennifer Watson from Watson Investments, a holistic wealth management firm, and also the Vice Chair of the YPEG Oakville Chamber of Commerce Committee. And it's my privilege today to be able to moderate the event. First, I'm going to introduce Lena DeMarco. She is the Regional Director, Community Affairs with Bell Canada. Bell Canada is a proud sponsor of the Oakville Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Lena.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Ian Dawe in taking time out of his busy schedule in these uncertain times. Today, in what is becoming a familiar format in the new world that we do live in, we are going to be treated to what promises to be an uplifting presentation. On behalf of all my colleagues at Bell, we are very proud to be supporting Dr. Ian Dawe and the Oakville Chamber. Bell's own operating principles in response to COVID-19 has been to keep Canadians connected and informed, prioritize the health and safety of the public, our team, customers, and communities. So our special guest speaker today is Dr. Ian Dawe. Dr. Ian Dawe is an associate professor of psychiatry at the University of Toronto. He is the program chief and medical director of mental health at Trillium Health Partners in Mississauga. He is also part of the Bell Let's Talk team of subject matter experts, providing information on how to recognize and help people within the organization struggling with mental health issues. It's worth noting that the Bell Let's Talk recently announced new funding of $5 million for 5 organizations delivering mental health support to youth, family, and communities during COVID-19 crisis. For more information on Dr. Ian Dawe's bio and presentation, it will be on the Oakville Chamber site. I will now pass the presentation over to Dr. Ian Dawe, and there will also be a Q&A after the presentation. Over to you, Dr. Dawe.
Thanks, Lena, and thank you for everybody for joining us. It's a real pleasure to be with you today to talk about what truly are strange and unusual times. When we had initially kind of talked about this presentation and some of the things that might be interesting to the members of the chamber, we were specifically focused around COVID, the response to it, the changes and challenges in our society as a result of that. But clearly, even in the last few weeks, with the social upheavals and the challenges in the United States and across the world, things are even more unusual and more unsettled. The principles of what we wanted to talk about today certainly still are applicable, and I think even more so given everything that's going on. And we've modified the talk a little bit to be beyond COVID into all of the challenges of working from home, dealing with the anxieties of circumstances, the challenges and stresses in relationships, et cetera, et cetera. We're going to try to wrap all of that up in about 35 minutes or so to leave plenty of time for questions. So with your permission, we'll get started. I'm going to switch over to the screen share and we'll get going. So I titled the talk, Flattening the Other Curve. And in some respects, that was very much because many of us in the healthcare industry have been talking a lot about flattening the COVID curve, the infections, and the wishes that we had to mitigate some of the stresses that the hospital sector and our healthcare sector were going to experience. But clearly, it's more than just that. And I'm incredibly thankful to Bell and to the chamber itself with an opportunity, as Lena has mentioned, to come before you today and to talk about it. I've been part of the Let's Talk experiences for many years now, and I'm just incredibly grateful for the opportunity and for what Bell has brought, I think, to the national conversation in the country on mental health. As I was saying, over the course of the next 35 minutes or so, we'll have these agenda items, talking a little bit about the infection, the pandemic, our responses to it, the stress and the anxieties that come from that, and how, with some best practice tips, we can all manage it for each other and for those around us, be they coworkers or loved ones. I really like this graphic. This is a graphic that came from Victor Singh, who is a physician scientist out of Atlanta. And it was one of the most telling graphics that I was aware of that really looked through the various waves of the COVID pandemic itself. Wave one was very much dealing with the morbidity and the mortality of the disease process. With a tail wave, wave one tail, as it's called, really dealing with the after effects, the remission, the recovery of the disease. Wave two became all the more sophisticated regarding the impact of the resource restrictions on people's other conditions. All the usual urgent things that people would come for healthcare for. Now those conditions and those opportunities for care were being either delayed or put off because so much of the resources were going to the COVID experience. Wave three is the impact on chronic conditions which were no longer being actively managed. And here it was because people were staying home, either out of fear or getting the virus itself, or because hospitals, again, had shifted their resources to deal with the pandemic and its scenarios, worst case or otherwise. And as a mental health professional, it was wave four that was most interesting academically to me, and from an administrative standpoint and an organizational standpoint, most relevant to prepare for. That sense about the psychic trauma, the mental ill health, post-traumatic stress disorder, the impact of economic injury on our societies, burnout of our healthcare professionals, those types of things. So that fourth wave, which we're beginning to see now, was the thing that we started focusing on really quickly. In order to think a little bit in more detail about the mental health impact of COVID, this infographic from the Hertfordshire Trust in the UK, I thought was quite illustrative. And you can see impacts here right across the lifespan, from preterm considerations for young people, children and adolescents, adults, and all the way through the aged in our society. COVID, the response to COVID and the aftermath of COVID has been affecting all of those areas. At Trillium Health Partners, where I work, we're really trying to be present for our society and for our patients and family members in all of these areas. And as you can imagine, that's a significant undertaking. A few weeks ago, an Ipsos Reid survey was actually published, and it looked at Ontario's population and some of the coping strategies that they were using in dealing with the mental health stresses of COVID specifically. Now, admittedly, the survey really spoke to, and this graph is illustrative of it, some of the more maladaptive coping strategies that people were engaged in. Maladaptive would refer to the strategies that people would use, which might temporarily relieve the symptoms of stress or anxiety, but didn't really contribute to actually solving the problem that was causing the anxiety to begin with. Things like avoidance, drinking, emotional numbing, gambling, those types of things. And as you can see, I have to say, it's more than a little worrisome that 42% of the people were acknowledging a net increase in substance use and gambling as some of the strategies that they were using to get through this time. The outbreak has left many people feeling uncertain and struggling to cope. And I really like this as an organizing graphic depicting the 3 zones of coping: fear, learning, growth, and the actions associated with each. Just take a moment here to do a bit of a temperature check. How are you feeling these days? Which zone are you in? Are you stuck in the fear zone and needing some support to move forward? Do you find yourself occupying aspects of all of the zones? Ideally, we want to see people's responses moving from the left to the right across this continuum as their coping and their familiarity with the crisis matures. We acknowledge this at the beginning, though. This time is not just about COVID any longer. And from our perch here in Canada above the United States, we've been watching in shock as the country we've long considered our closest friend and our protector now seems to be acting like a crazed, erratic, and dangerous stranger. It's a dystopian time. It feels unfamiliar. It feels miserable. And it stresses us, and it calls on us to be resilient in our coping. But because we hear a lot about what resiliency should be, sometimes we can use the term pretty lackadaisically without really considering what it means. In the context of exposure to significant adversity of any kind, really, resiliency is basically the capacity to adapt. Now, many of the resiliency theories that I've encountered so far in my professional career make a lot of good common sense. But almost all resilient people are common in 3 ways. They possess a staunch, non-judgmental acceptance of reality, the so-called radical acceptance. When you accept a situation as it is, even if it's terrible, even if it's awful, in a non-judgmental attitude. The second characteristic is an uncanny ability to improvise. And the third reflects a deep belief, buttressed by strong principles and values, that life is meaningful. You can bounce back from hardship with just 1 or 2 of those qualities, but you only really be truly resilient if in fact you possess all 3 of them. But it's not enough to just tell people to be resilient, to just get with it, to suck it up, to move past their circumstances. Particularly because these days, the virus, our response to it, and the social and economic changes of that response have threatened the very capacities and the structures that we've used to be resilient in the first place. Things like our professional identities, our connections, the structure of our jobs, food and financial security, all these things that we've used to form our resiliency have now been influenced by the things that we're struggling to cope with. So to cope now, to cope into the near future, we have to repair. We've got to replace. We've got to rebuild the basic fundamental underpinnings of resiliency. And I've got 4 of them. The first one is about hope. For those of you who are not necessarily feeling hopeful right now, it is really important to choose, to mindfully choose some aspect of our future to be hopeful about. New opportunities that will come post-lockdown. an unexpected connection and a relationship that you've developed with your appropriately distanced neighbor. Something to that effect, to choose hope. The second is about purpose. And as a frontline healthcare worker, I have to say how valuable it's been to hear the cheering in the streets, the honking of horns, the encouragement of the general public that we're doing a good job. That nurtures the sense of belonging and purpose that we have maintained, and it sustains us. But in talking more about belonging, we want to also talk about the social isolation and the physical distancing that really does threaten belonging for many people. Encourage yourselves, encourage people to choose to maintain that sense of belonging, sense of connection with coworkers, with family members, with community, with nature, can really help shift our perspectives when we're dealing with hardship. It reminds us we're not alone and that we're in this together. I spoke about belonging, and here it is again, from a purpose standpoint. Your sense of purpose, your previous sense of purpose might have been shattered by this experience. You may be working in a very different way than you were before. The devastation of certain people's savings, the reality of food insecurity. But it's incredibly important not to accept that as being something that is completely outside your control. Once you've grieved the reality of those losses, it's important to move on to rebranding yourself. Find new purpose in the things that you're doing right now. Commit fully to the opportunity that's been presented to you, even if it's not the one that you would have chosen under other circumstances or even wanted. But focus on it and do it well, because this is temporary. It will pass. And finally, there is this sense about meaning. It's about maintaining or rebuilding the life that's worth living. There may well be constraints on what our life looks like right now, and that's okay. We have to and we should accept that. But don't ever let there be a constraint on whether you think your life is worth living or not. It is, and everyone can support one another in that message. Those strategies, focusing on purpose and belonging and meaning and hope, they can take some time to work. Again, it is about mindfully choosing to bring them into our lives and to surface them and focus on them. We got to practice that regularly, and we've got to practice it in all of the different situations that we're focused on right now. Don't be too hard on yourself if you forget to do something or if you're not feeling better right away. There's actually no such thing as failing at this point. It's all about doing the best you can under the current circumstances. So with that, we have to talk about stress and anxiety. And with all of these things, taken to calling it a dystopian era, how much stress and anxiety is actually normal at this time? Well, the uncertainty about the changes that are unfolding around us can make most of us feel pretty anxious. That's normal. It's actually okay. It can help motivate us to take action to protect ourselves and to support others, or to learn more about what else we can do. It's when the anxiety becomes difficult to control, when stress is overwhelming and it's impacting in our lives and our abilities to function appropriately. That's when we encourage people to come forward for support and help. Remember, everyone experiences anxiety. It's part of the emotional and protective responses that have been built into our human body. It's about managing the anxiety and overcoming it. That's where resiliency can shine. We may well be facing the first pandemic and social upheaval of many of our lives, but there are places that we can turn to learn from approaches that have worked in other areas. Disaster relief, for example. In the mental health space, that's all about psychological first aid. Psychological first aid is an evidence-informed approach to help people in the immediate aftermath of disaster and terrorism, things along those lines. It's designed to reduce the initial distress that's caused by a traumatic event and to foster short-term and longer-term adaptive functioning and those adaptive coping mechanisms. It's not about dealing with the there and then or the remote past. It's very much focused on the here and now and coping in the immediacy. One of those areas might be about challenging your thoughts, challenging your worries, challenging your anxious thoughts in particular. Because high levels of anxiety and stress are usually fueled by the way we think. For example, in the immediate aftermath of the COVID experience, as it was running rampant through our population, it was very common to hear people say, I'm going to get sick, I'm going to die, there's nothing I can do, or I'm not going to be able to cope with this. However, it is incredibly important to realize that not all of our thoughts are actual facts. Many are simply just thoughts or worries that we hold. Just because it's something that we are familiar with and that we think about, it doesn't actually make it true, no matter how loud the thought would be or how familiar it might be. There is a difference between a thought and objective outside reality. And because of that, we encourage people to challenge those anxious thoughts or those negative thoughts. Don't accept worry or distress as being inevitable. Focus on adapting and coping with new situations without losing sight of the values that make us who we are and who we want to be. There's a great many things that we can do to self-care in those uncertain times. Keeping a consistent sleep schedule, for example. Limiting the amount of caffeine, alcohol, marijuana that we're consuming. Making sure we still engage in physical activities every day. Practicing relaxation and meditation before bedtime. As much as possible under the circumstances, fresh vegetables, drinking lots of water. Remember, comfort foods aren't actually good for you. And engaging with other people, most importantly. You may be physically separated, but use whatever platform works for you, whatever virtual tools, social media, telephones. Bring that approach to focus on improving that sense of belonging again. We're social beings by nature, and being isolated and alone for a prolonged period of time is damaging to our well-being. That's why we thought very strongly and spoke out a lot at the beginning of the pandemic. This was not ever to be about social distancing. This was physical distancing. And physical distancing, okay, I can accept that. That is infection control practice. But we can't limit our social nature as human beings because that actually damages who we are. Now, in normal times, working and living in separate places provides some buffer between an employee's home and their work lives. The distinctions between personal and professional selves are common across all cultures, and it has its benefits. Although we normally carry some impact of work home with us, we can physically leave a toxic work culture or a difficult meeting or a problematic colleague because it's over there at the office. Well, not anymore. Managing in uncertain times means that we need to think about who we are supporting. And it's not just about supporting ourselves or supporting our colleagues. It's about supporting our partners too. And supporting our partners is about thinking of how we work together, how we understand the stresses that each other are going through. And for many of us who are cohabitating with other people who are working, in the middle of this global pandemic, we realize this impacts all of us. Well, in normal times, most couples, again, witness their partner's work stress. Few have actually had the experience of living with it so closely. Right? You can hear about your partner's difficult boss, but to actually witness them being berated over a video conference is a whole different level of stress. So how do we acknowledge our partner's work stresses in a way that bolsters their emotional well-being as well as our own, and recognize that we can't really remove the root cause of that stress? Well, first and foremost, I would recommend give them the gift of regular, undivided attention. Many couples are now together all the time. And I'm hearing that a lot of them, even despite that, are feeling lonely in their relationships. By having to pack so much into every single day, work, household chores, homeschooling, they end up feeling like they're neglecting one another. Yet having our loved ones' undivided attention, a time we can just be open and vent our frustrations, is in fact one of the most important release valves for stress. Even if it's 15 minutes a day, at the end of the day, just agree to be together and listen openly and attentively. No suggestions, no advice, just listen. And then check how best to support your partner. What would make sense for them under these circumstances? How do they need to be supported? Because that's often something that's changing. Whereas in the past, people would have wanted that emotional validation and support. Now they might actually prefer a different negotiation around the household chores. Who's going to do what? How are you going to do these things? And then you can move into scheduling that and actually mapping it out, focusing on doing this together. That's, I think, about taking care of our partners. Back to managing in stress, though, if we switch our attention back to the workplace. For many leaders, managing in a crisis, at least at the beginning of a crisis, can feel extremely energizing and meaningful. Yet often when you visit those same leaders a few weeks later, they report something's happened to the energy and the way their teams are collaborating. That adrenaline-fueled pace of the initial crisis response begins to sputter, and problems come more complex. They become more exhausting. The varnish starts to crack. The glory fades. The fuses are short. Well, most crises roughly follow a pattern: emergency, regression, and recovery. And as we acknowledged in the beginning, when the emergency becomes clear, teams' energies tend to rise. Performance actually goes up. Almost all of us have lots of unknown reserves, and our reaction feels full of purpose, and much gets done. We tend to think of the best version of ourselves coming forward in that time. But then the second phase hits, regression. When people get tired, they lose their sense of purpose. They start fighting about the small stuff. They forget to do basic things. The concept of regression comes from adaptive coping. It's about people rolling back to a less mature stage when faced with ongoing pressures. It's one of the mind's ways that we have of defending ourselves from confusion or from insecurity, to retreat to an emotional comfort zone. But it's actually the most dangerous phase of a coping strategy for teams. Research has shown for soldiers, the most stressful events don't actually involve the dangerous missions requiring courage and action. They actually involve waiting, being in the middle of nowhere, on post, repairing equipment, handling administrative tasks, not being able to use their training. It turns out it's boredom, the lack of a new experience, monotony, that's toxic to performance. And fatigue is in our leaders now, and it's in our teams. It's real and it's infectious, and it seems to hit you like a hammer one day to the next. The regression phase is uncomfortable, admittedly, but it's unavoidable. It can't be skipped over. And it's important for you to know about it so that you can work on adaptively moving through it to get to the recovery phase, the third phase, when we can focus on reopening, rebuilding, and preparing for the future. And the key for that is to invent new ways of performing old routines, maintaining a sense of familiarity and consistency, because it's both comforting and therapeutic in a time of upheaval. But it's also practical. When you're going to be fighting for every inch of productivity, you want every day to feel like an established habit. No wasted times, no wondering what's for lunch or when we're going to be going outside to play. So maintaining routine is the first step. Keeping the structure of the day the same as it's typically been as much as possible. Beyond just the familiarity of that, maintaining a regular schedule is going to help you with firm guideposts for building your work and your home schedules. The second is building a schedule for the week that incorporates those routines at a high level, but it's modified to account for work blocks and for new responsibilities like meals and chores and childcare and homeschooling. In your planning, ask yourselves what's your kids' schedules, not just your own schedule. What are you going to have for each meal? What are you going to do the chores? When are the key work meetings? What is crucial to have somebody on and somebody in reserve? And then take that information and plop it into a calendar. Mindfully put it into a structure, because that's what's going to help formalize this approach. And if you need to, swap in new ways of doing old things. Virtual meetups, childcare that can be done through technology, new ways of thinking about doing things. This is the flexibility that was acknowledged for resiliency. We have to be able to take advantage of the tools that are available to us now to be able to do things in situations in which our old ways just aren't practical. We need to learn to lean on our villages now more than ever before. The nature of these multiple crises requires that we find safe and responsible ways to help each other out, while upholding our old responsibilities at work and at home and taking on new ones all at the same time. So lean on your village, the other parents in your community, your parents, your families, your broader scenarios. Share the responsibilities out as much as you can. Accept that things aren't going to run smoothly, completely. We're not going to be 100% of ourselves all the time. But with those tempered expectations and a flexible approach and resourcefulness, you'll be amazed at how much we can adapt together. And we'll emerge from this crisis stronger and hopefully more collaborative. I was going through the Harvard Business Review recently, and I found this article, which I thought both timely and appropriate to share with you. So I've put it on screen here for your benefit. It's about the challenges of remote work. I thought we'd take the last few minutes just to quickly highlight some of these things. Because when we're thinking about the common challenges, we need to understand, what is it about remote work that makes it especially demanding? How do otherwise high-performing employees experience an actual decline in their job performance or engagement when they begin working remotely? Well, part of it is about lack of face-to-face supervision. Both managers and their employees often express concerns about the lack of face-to-face, three-dimensional interaction. Supervisors worry their employees are not going to be working as hard or as efficiently. Employees, on the other hand, struggle with reduced access to managerial support and communication. In some cases, they might feel that remote managers are out of touch with their specific needs, and thereby they're neither being supportive nor helpful. Lack of access to information is another area. Newly remote workers are often surprised by the added time and the effort that it takes to locate information from coworkers. Even getting what seems to be answers to simple questions can feel like it's a large obstacle when you're working from home. We talked about the social isolation already, and it's worth mentioning briefly again. Loneliness is one of the most common complaints about remote work. And employees missing that informal social interaction of an office setting. It's thought that extroverts might suffer that isolation even more in the short run. And I've certainly heard people who, in my own practice, tend to be more introverted say that they're weathering the storm perhaps better than others. But it affects all of us, for sure. Over a longer period of time, anxiety rises and people's stress levels go up when isolation is an area of concern. And the distractions at home. This might be obvious because, like the photo I showed you a few minutes ago, representing remote work, portraying a parent holding a child and typing on a laptop on the living room floor, it's in fact a terrible representation of what effective virtual work should be. It's what virtual work is, oftentimes, especially nowadays. But we've long thought that the most effective type of virtual work was dedicated quiet workspaces, things that actually had built-in separation from home and workspace in the nature of the duties that we have and the situations that we're dealing with, trying to limit how those demands impinge on us. What we've discovered is that when remote work is turned on all of a sudden, when it's turned on in response to crises, we're often less prepared to do that. I'll give an example. Some of our clinicians have wanted to work from home, partially because of limiting the foot traffic in the building in relation to the COVID experiences, and often because the technology was available to allow them to do that. But we have to be very cautious about what that means, because just because you can do healthcare from home doesn't necessarily mean you should. What about information privacy? What about information security? How can a confidential interaction between a therapist and a client and their family take place in a one-bedroom apartment where there's multiple other things going on? It's a challenge. Remote work is not as easy or as glamorous as I think it initially sounded. And as such, the second part of the article focused on how do we make remote work better? How do we support our employees? And as managers, I think it is important to think about establishing structured daily check-ins. Touch base with your teams on a regular basis. Ask how they're doing. Find out how they need to be supported. Make those calls regular and predictable. Use several different forms of communication. It's not just all about Zoom. It's not just all about Microsoft Teams. It's not just all about FaceTime, WebEx, Adobe Connects, or the myriad of other technologies. But use the tools relevant for the type of communication you're doing. Not everything has to be a video conference. Some things can be done by text. Some things are more appropriate on the phone. Establish rules of engagement. Figure out how remote work can be as efficient and as satisfying when we set our expectations appropriately. Use the video conference for some things, use the instant messaging for other things. Codify that in the rule of engagement. Provide opportunities for remote social interactions. Some people are nominally just really good at this. Some of us have to think our way to remind ourselves and do it. But it's an essential step that a manager can take to make sure that we're structuring ways our colleagues can still interact socially. Some of the easiest ways to do that is to leave time at the beginning of meetings and team calls for just some non-work conversation. Open the meeting with, we're going to spend the first few minutes just catching up with each other. Host a virtual pizza party in which you deliver pizza to all of your team members at the same time, just as the conference is getting started. Or virtual office parties in which care packages can be sent in advance and opened and enjoyed simultaneously. Offer that encouragement and emotional support, because research shows that truly does have a trickle-down effect on employees and on engagement. That multiple-pronged approach can really pay off. Well, as we wrap up, I just wanted to come back to ground ourselves in the larger work that's been going on as part of the Let's Talk campaign for many years now. And I think while that has tremendously benefited our society as a whole, it's made the conversation of mental health in Canada vastly different than it was 10 years ago. It's so relevant now because it's still hard to talk about mental health. The way we talk about it is part of the complexity. And it's important to think about how we use our language so that we take every opportunity to encourage the best conversations without negatively impacting the people that we're talking about. And think about this. Talking about behavioral health really does make a difference. The words that we use can make us step back from the intent, the positive intent that we have. A person commits a crime, but they die from suicide. They don't commit suicide. So there are many examples of how that language that we use can be sensitive, and it can shift to a recovery-oriented approach that really fosters the well-being of the person and doesn't contribute to stigma. Stigma's been around for a long time, and knowing the facts and the myths about mental health and mental illness is a great way that will help contribute to the end of stigma. So read about those facts, talk to people, find out what the myths are, and join us in being a stigma buster. Simple acts of kindness, like we were talking about, can make a world of difference. Whether it's a smile, being the good, objective, committed listener, inviting people for those virtual meetups, coffees, chats, these simple acts of kindness really can help open up the conversation. But the good conversation is about being kind and limiting an expression like, it's okay, you'll get over it, just relax. Those things minimize the person's feelings and what their experiences are. Again, remember, good listening is about the listening, not about the talking. When you do need to talk. It's okay. But talk about things like this. I'm sorry you're not feeling well. I've noticed you seem down recently. Is everything okay? How can I help? Being the good listener is asking permission and for guidance in how to engage with that person. They'll give it to you. They'll tell you, as long as we're open to listening and hearing and then acting. It's breaking the silence. It's such an awkward kind of conversation at times to have that our default mechanisms can come into silence. But mental illness touches all of us. Mental ill health touches all of us, either directly or indirectly, through friends, through families, through colleagues. The stories of people who've experienced mental health challenges and who are now doing well, those can really challenge the stereotypes that continue to exist. Most people with a mental health issue can and will recover. We can help with that just by talking about it. So in summary, every action counts when we're talking about mental health. It's no different than physical health. It does not have to be such an awkward conversation. And again, I am indebted to Bell to participate with them on the Let's Talk campaign to be able to spread that message. Thank you to the Chamber for the opportunity to address some fascinatingly challenging things that are going on in our society right now. And I thought I would just end with a couple of curated virtual coping strategies and self-management resources that I often recommend in my practice. Things like mindfulness-based stress reduction apps, Calm, Headspace, things like an artificial intelligence chatbot that came out of Harvard and Stanford universities. It's built out of the principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. It's called a Woebot, W-O-E-B-O-T. And the 24-hour, 7-day-a-week anonymous peer support platform, Big White Wall. All of these things have marshaled technology and have put it into the hands of our consumers and our customers so that we can provide wraparound support anywhere, anytime, at a place of a person's choosing. That's the future of mental health care. We're glad to be part of it with our partners and happy to talk more about it with you today. So thank you very much for allowing me to talk so far.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dawe. That was very interesting. You gave us so much information I think is very helpful for our everyday lives, but also our lives right now dealing with this change of pace that we've experienced. So to start our question and answer period off, we had a lot of questions actually come in during your presentation, which is great. So we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. There's an analogy that I heard a few years ago, and it's really stuck with me. And it was the fact that we go to the gym to work out our bodies. And sometimes we get a personal trainer, or maybe we get a dietitian to help us with that. And going and seeing somebody, a professional, third party, maybe it's a therapist, to work out our minds can kind of be how maybe we think about and reduce our, maybe even our own mental our own stigma we have around mental health. So anyways, that was just something that kind of really stuck and resonated with me. Are there any other tips that you have for us in terms of reducing the stigma around mental health that can exist in some of us?
The stigma is often something that it's there, And we have to acknowledge it. But the best way of acknowledging it is to be open about it, and it is to challenge those preconceptions, all of the things that you were just mentioning, all the things that we went through a few minutes ago in the talk, of just saying, does it have to be this way? Does it have to be something that actually is what we don't talk about? Well, we do have to overcome some of our old tendencies. I was raised in a stiff upper lip kind of British culture where you just kind of move on, and you know that grit, and that's the way you deal with things. Actually the most helpful kind of thing when you're dealing with something and you need an opportunity to talk about it. So knowing it's okay, knowing that people will hear us and they won't judge us, they'll just practice that mindful engagement. I think it's that conversation, and that's what the biggest tip is.
And do you think through COVID has the conversation changed at all?
I think it has in a lot of respects, because we are talking about the stress. We are talking about how difficult this is and how different it is. You know, it's the first pandemic I've ever lived through, for sure. And although I've seen social upheavals and racial tensions before, it's unusual to have them happen both at the same time, and to have one of the greatest economic catastrophes since the Great Depression, and to be all dealing with this together. In a lot of respects, that level setting, that we're all dealing with this all at the same time, has made it easier to acknowledge, I'm kind of stressed today. You know, this is a difficult thing, because it's no longer just about us. It's about us. And I think that has made it easier to talk about.
It's good to hear that. And so you gave us some helpful tips in terms of if our loved ones are suffering from mental illness, whether it's clinical or maybe it's situational, how can we best support them? You mentioned, active listening as one of the tips. Are there other tips that you have for us?
It's not about trying to solve the problem for the person. The principles of active listening and being a good partner is about listening and understanding what's going on and being unconditionally supportive. But it's not about trying to solve the problem that our partners might be going through at the time, because that might be impossible. We might not have access or control of specific situations that a person's going through, whether it's because they're battling illness or they're battling the stresses of their work environment or their day-to-day experiences that are creating more of a mental ill health, if you will, as a mental illness. So recognizing we don't try to solve their problems, but we're there, we're unconditionally supportive, continue to help focus on the things that we can do, about talking about love, talking about acceptance, reminding them to eat, reminding them to sleep, to engage in the routines, to not get into that all-consuming trap of stress. I think those are some basic tips that can really help reorient a person who's dealing with stress in finding that they can continue to separate from it.
Okay. Yeah, that's very helpful. That makes a lot of sense. So one of the things we've done at our office actually is 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, every morning, we start our day off actually with a team Zoom call and face to face, and we see each other. Sometimes we talk about work-related items. Other times it's just, how was your day? How was your weekend? We've actually had dress-up days. We've had game days, and I think it's been fun. The team seems to really enjoy it, which is great. So what other tips do you have for us in terms of boosting our office culture and morale?
I really like some of those ideas, and it's tempting because of the need for the productivity to be high, to
Mhm.
pack the meeting agendas and to just try to cram in as many things as possible.
Right.
But this is a time where we have to not do that. So it just, as you were talking about, building some time at the beginning of the meeting to allow that socialization, having separate meetings too.
Mhm.
I was mentioning earlier about making sure that you can have simultaneous pizzas or Thai food or Chinese
Yeah.
food delivered
Yeah.
to your employees so that you can be doing that all at the same time.
Mhm.
At the hospital, we had several of our physicians are moving into retirement this month. And we had for many months planned the big parties and the going away celebrations. And we had to transform that into an evening Zoom where we could all sit around and have the glass of champagne to virtually toast them. And we did that and embraced that, knowing that it was the best we could do at the time,
Mhm.
but with the promise that once this lockdown moderates, we'll get together and we'll do it again and we'll do it
Mhm.
in person. That difference between the 2-dimension and the 3-dimensional aspect
Yeah.
of social interaction. 2 dimensions, okay, in the,
Mhm.
but we don't want to ever have it replace
Yes.
permanently the
Yes.
connections.
Yeah, that's true. I've heard that about conferences actually, how, it's great that we're doing these online, and maybe we'll do more online in the future, but we won't eliminate all of the in-person things when we can go back to that. So,
I'm not a fan of the term "the new normal," but in a lot of respects, we're not going back to the cultures that we had exactly the way they were before.
mhm,
Too much has changed.
sure.
Too much
Yeah.
has been upended. So
Mhm.
the aspects of technology assisted work have
Mhm.
come to us faster and more embedded than we
Mhm.
ever would have done if we had kind of planned our way to this time. We did it because we had to, and I
Mhm.
doubt we're going to give that up.
Mhm. Well, one final question for you today, just to be mindful of the time, is what are some of the activities that we can try and do to actually increase our resiliency?
Um, I mentioned the 4 earlier,
Mhm.
finding hope, finding purpose,
Mhm.
finding meaning, and finding belonging, because I
Mhm.
think those are the areas that if we focus on them, it'll help us rebuild. And again, the point was that our resiliency is challenged now.
Mhm.
Very things that we were confident that we had the power to be resilient in have been upended. We are not as financially secure as we
Mhm.
were before. We are not as confident in our society as we were before in the kind of norms of it. Maybe we should never have been confident in the racial tensions that existed under the surface for a long time. Maybe we have been willfully blind to those things.
Mhm.
This has kind of torn that blindfold off and has forced us to reckon as equals in society of what that is.
Mhm.
That's okay. That can be something that fills us with new purpose and a new opportunity for a common move. Similarly, with the tensions that exist now, I don't think we're going to come back from that. This isn't something we'll forget about. It won't be
Yeah.
out of the news cycles in 24 hours or 48 hours, like unfairly past events have been. This has charged all of us, and if we take fair-minded opportunity and move forward with purpose and meaning, and in that collectivity, we'll find our resiliency supercharged.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dr. Dawe. That was great. Very, very interesting and helpful for our audience. So that I'm just going to conclude us right now. It's just after 2 p.m. Thank you again very much, Bell Canada, for supporting this event, and for the Oakville Chamber of Commerce and the YPEG committee. Dr. Dawe, thank you so much for your time and for all of the work that you are doing in the mental health space. It's really appreciated. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. And hopefully you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all.